co-presenting, so both of us will be presenting rather than one and then the other. So thank you again, and bear with us, right? So this is a work in progress of sorts, because part of the idea is to also try to arrive at some kind of collective understanding, collective, not necessarily collective analysis, since obviously there's always space for disagreement and difference, but at least try to get at some collective understanding of major concepts that have shaped and informed both Mexican politics, Zapatismo, but also the work that we do here on this side of the border when engaging with these questions. So, as we know, the Zapatistas have long spoken of colonization as a long night of 500 years. That said, there's been a lot that has been said and written about Indigenismo del Estado, or the idea of indigenism as a state project, as a project to forge a common national identity, right? And this obviously post-revolution. But the idea of indigenismo as a state project has always gone hand in hand with the construction of Mexico as a mestizo nation, and tied to that a number of constellation of concepts and people such as Vasconcelos and la raza cósmica. Okay, so some key history and concepts I would add would be Juan José Vasconcelos, who was then the Minister of Education, was put in charge of the schools. And the schools, much like Americanization and boarding schools here in the U.S. and how they were used against indigenous people here, these schools became the basis for instilling this building this national project, one in which, through this concept of la raza cósmica, or the cosmic race, in essence, Mexico was trying to modernize itself and built upon this notion that it was a mestizo, and what constitutes a mestizo is this mixture of all races, right? The white, for lack of better terms, white, black, red, and yellow, and that it is this mixture that creates this generic mestizo, and by extension, this mestizo nation, right? This understood as a project of modernization, as a project of progress, and most importantly, as many critics have pointed to, although proclaimed as something to embrace, fundamentally as a project in which, through that mixture, one is moving away from the indigenous, right? One is no longer as indigenous. You're mixed and therefore non-indigenous. So this project of mestizaje goes hand in hand with building this notion of Mexico as a modern nation. And ultimately what it does is that it creates a sense of indigenous people as something so only of the past. That the present and the future is indeed mestizo, mestiza, mestizex, no sé cómo se diría nowadays. But in freezing people, indigenous people in particular, in the past, part of what that relies on is also creating a notion of an authentic Indian. And the only authentic Indians are those which are of the past and that we're in essence moving away from. We will honor the indigenous, but only as past, right? We honor an indigenous past that informs our presence, our heritage, but we are no longer indigenous.
And just to kind of jump on that, so when we think about Mexico and the project to modernize and the project of modernity at the turn of the 20th century, we do fall back on this idea of indigenismo that's put forward by the state, but it's an indigenismo from above, right? This indigenismo is articulated onto the people themselves. And so the state itself is creating and manufacturing, in a sense, the Indian of Mexico, the indigenous of Mexico. And it's important to kind of demarcate how the state manufactures that through mestizaje and this idea of mixture as removing peoples from that structural position or that relationship to the state.
So part of the purpose today, or how we try to understand this session, is to draw from a different type of genealogy, a different type of calendar, a different type of geography, as the Zapatistas have often reminded us, and indeed a long historical understanding and analysis of mestizaje and indigenismo, right? And to essentially differentiate between what we would call this indigenismo from above and an indigenismo from below and to the left. So it is important to understand this distinction, right? Because to understand indigenismo and mestizaje, not just as a state project of 1930s post-revolutionary Mexico, but as part of a broader 520 plus year civilizatory project, or a project of civilization, of Western civilization proper, that is ultimately linked to modernity, coloniality, colonialism, and that itself has many different axes of domination through which it is operationalized. So when we think about the Hydra capitalista, it's also important to think about this broader context of a civilization of death. That ultimately what we're dealing with is a broader civilizational package that includes within it notions of race, notions of gender, notions of capitalism, notions of heteronormativity. We could go on and on. This is what Bonfil Batalla differentiated as the basis for two distinct Mexicos. So if you're not familiar with Bonfil Batalla's book, Mexico Profundo, it carries the same title in both English and Spanish, very important read. But he differentiates between an imaginary Mexico and a Mexico Profundo, a deep or profound Mexico. And related to that, one of the central arguments for Batalla is that colonization, in effect, was a process or a project of a civilizational project of de-Indianization, or de-Indian. He uses a language in Spanish of de-Indianization. Some people refer to it as de-indigenization, but we'll probably use here the two overlapping. But in order to understand what that actually means and put it in conversation then with el indigenismo del Estado, the Mestizo project, we both agree that it's also important to understand another scholar whose work, Lenape Pogatanska, a historian, Jack Forbes, is also crucial for a broader and deeper understanding and conceptual clarity on these concepts.
Yeah, so Jack D. Forbes, when he conceptualizes this idea of the mestizo concept, he actually goes back to Spain. And so his departure from Spain is to talk about how mestizaje is not particular to Mexico or Latin America or all of the Americas. Mestizaje happens all over the world. Mixture between, quote-unquote races happens to a lot of different people all over the world. So by situating Spain and specifically the Iberian Peninsula, he talks about how Spaniards themselves were mixed race subjects, how Spanish were, they were black, they were white, there were a lot of different ethnic groups. Spain was a very mixed place. So for Jack D. Forbes, situating Spain and the Spaniard kind of disrupts the notion of purity, and especially that racial purity that Spaniards were trying to bring into Mexico by demarcating themselves as white people.
Yeah, so if we don't, some of us, we do some work in Spain, and we're coming from a Chicano context here, an indigenous context here, we tend to say, well, why Spain? We got to decolonize here. But the thing is that if we only start here, then we start from our starting point is essentially Americas, indigenous, Spain, Europe, white. And we've already accepted a foundational myth of the last 500 years of this civilization of death, because it's only in and through colonization that Spain, or which itself was only emerging, right, as an entity, tries to demarcate itself as white, tries to deny its own mixed history, and you have mestizaje emerge as a concept, first the castas, and then mestizaje only in Mexico, right, in other parts of Latin America as well, but in Mexico most strongly because it was needed to be used as a wedge between indigenous peoples. So if you are indigenous and now you're mixed, it becomes an approximation to whiteness. You're getting closer to whiteness, not quite there, but it's the allure of whiteness to separate you from the indigenous. And this is essentially what Batalla refers to as de-Indianization, right? So de-Indianization, to go back to Batalla's imaginary Mexico and Mexico Profundo, we have those that took the red pill and those that took the blue pill, right? We have those that bought into this project of mestizaje, bought into this project of de-Indianization. And when I say that, I should qualify that. Some of it was willing, most of it was by violence. I don't want to just say it's all willing. I need to be mindful of that. But that said, right here in the U.S., we talk about boarding schools I mentioned earlier, but there is this understanding that trauma travels across generations, right? That the survivors, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of those that were part of the boarding schools, they're doing that work of reclamation. In essence, that's what, to add a footnote here, I would say mestizos need to think about as well, right? Those who identify as mestizas and so on, that we too are the products of this process. And we too have some work to do, as a good friend of mine in Mexico says, Betún, he talks about desamestizamiento. I'm looking at the interpreter just to make sure So desamestizamiento as a project of re-Indianization. But in order to kind of highlight that, we have a short video, a short clip that we wanted to, again, provide this longer historical understanding of how Spanish colonialism informs the Mexican state, and which arguably, we only begin with mestizaje as post-revolutionary project. We lose sight of the fact that this is really only the secularization of a Christian-centric cosmology of salvation. To become mestizo is to become better, right? It's saving the Indian from himself. So to illustrate that long historical continuity, this video is from the late 1970s. It shows how this is still part of a colonial present, but we do have one disclaimer. You want to do or should I?
It's by a white anthropologist. So, keep that in mind when you're watching it, right? How do you interpret the imaginary Mexico being imposed onto indigenous peoples, and Mexico Profundo, which you'll see, and this idea that we need to create mestizos, we need to create modern subjects.
So we chose this clip on purpose, both because of the continuation, I chose continuation of that process, but also in part it's comic relief, right? But because it clearly illustrates this white gaze that we'll also come back to for the discussion.
why is the dance called Weiwei?
Because of the mixture between families. In Totonac, Sit means to intermingle. Kam is child. The Totonacs call the dance Sitkam, the intermingling of children, a mixture of Indian and Spanish blood.
Porque pues como esa danza es originada por Totonac, no es danza mestiza, no es danza de
Y yo lo veo en esto, fíjese, porque muchos acuden a comparar.
I don't see why the Indians ask the mestizos to become godparents, since the mestizos aren't much interested, except to get some advantage.
Aún más, pues yo veo así claramente que pues ellos lo hacen por sacar algún.
They become godparents, so the Indian will sell them his coffee.
Para eso se compra. Por eso les sueltan que sé yo que lleva el bautismo, que
Pure self-interest. Now the Indian knows that the mestizo doesn't like him.
sabe perfectamente que aquí que me hace daño,
But he still asks him.
que no lo quiere, y sin embargo llama.
I have found that the mestizo always sees the Indian as inferior.
Sinceramente es que siempre el mestizo pues ve al indígena.
So when they call them peasants because they speak Totonac and wear Indian clothes, it disgusts me.
Porque hablan su dialecto, me repugna.
Our main interest is that all the children learn Spanish.
Todos los niños en edad escolar, pues el castellano.
By his fourth year, the pupil is completely Hispanicized and he likes school.
Y si ya le gusta venir,
If he completes sixth grade, he will not be ashamed to go on to secondary school.
si sale de sexto ya está castellanizado, ya no tiene vergüenza de seguir en una secundaria.
If we speak Totonac to a sixth grade pupil, he is insulted. He says, I speak Spanish now. Why do you talk to me in Totonac?
Como decir, yo ya hablo castellano, ¿por qué me hablas Totonac?
Yes, they like school, and so they integrate into the life of the nation.
Ya se van integrando a la vida de la.
If their father had land, he sold it off, bit by bit.
Si tenía bastante terreno, ya lo fue vendiendo por pedazos.
So most pupils leave here to work in the cities.
Los alumnos se han ido fuera de aquí y están trabajando en Puebla, en México, en Costa Rica.
They change their Indian clothing when we make them wear uniforms. We make them buy commercial clothing. They get to like it, so they buy more.
Después les gusta, ya después se compran otro pantalón y lo conjugan con el mismo, con la misma
To
camisa.
go to secondary school, they must go on buying store clothing.
Ya se ven obligados a seguir comprando pantalones. Usted va ahorita a la telesecundaria, hay ¿Y los campesinos?
The Indian children themselves realize they shouldn't wear Indian clothes to school.
Que no deben ir de calzón, ellos mismos reconocen, no debo ir de calzón.
The Totonacs learn Spanish in school, and they see the need to wear store clothing.
Y por eso ya pues se ve la necesidad de...
Others go to work in the cities. They go in Indian clothes and come back in pants and shoes. Now those who go to the cities and return are called Ladinos. The Totonacs say, Tapalachnat, equalized. They say they've changed their shell. You're dressed like me, but you're not Mexican. But you're mestizo, even though you're American. The mestizos accept you. They invite you to their parties. But if you were a Ladino Indian, you wouldn't get the same treatment. The Indians criticize another Indian if he changes his clothes. They say he is a huehue because he dresses up like they do.
Parece un huevo porque ya se cambió como un huevo.
Okay. So obviously, some of you might be familiar with some of the what's presented here. For others, it might be first time seeing something like this. But an additional, I guess, disclaimer I should have mentioned at the beginning, right around language, right? How sometimes some things are lost in translation, but also how there's the use both of the word Indian, but also campesino, right? And sometimes that language historically of campesino as a worker, right? A peasant worker has been used to replace what is fundamentally indigenous populations, right? So in the 70s, you have all this leftist literature on peasant rebellions, but now in hindsight, right, where they're being rearticulated like, no, these were indigenous rebellions all along. It's just that we were trying to make them fit within this Marxist frame. So even the left sometimes engages in this type of colonial violence that reduces and erases indigenous peoples to simply their labor.
And again, if we think about the left from above, we can see how that they might articulate this imaginary Mexico as well. And so it's also important,
Progress.
right, progress, exactly. Colonialism.
Yeah, through progress of notions of progress and extractivism, even from the left, right? Embracing, let's say, a imaginary leftist Mexico. Sounds cool. But in any case, right, we also want to caution that they're already operating from ideas of race here in this video that are fundamentally issues pertaining to essentialized identities, right? That they're already accepting the Indian here, the white over there, the mestizo, something apart, authentic Indians, and so on. But so we want to caution around these types of identities, because essentially we then accept that foundational myth that I was talking about, and we lose sight about how these are fundamentally about relationships of power, right? So there's not so much power and domination that are imbricated across various different fields of life. You saw it in church, labor, school, even the children internalizing even how that they know how they're supposed to dress now if they want to keep going to secondary and so on. And important elaboration of this position was made by Su Comandante Marcos when at some point he was accused of being gay, as if somehow that was meant to bring shame to him and discredit him. Yet he responded very eloquently with this quote, which is not coming up on my screen. Yes, Marcos is gay. Marcos is gay in San Francisco, black in South Africa, a nation in Europe, a Chicano in San Isidro, an anarchist in Spain, a Palestinian in Israel, a Mayan Indian in the streets of San Cristobal, a Jew in Germany, a Roma in Poland, a Mohawk in Quebec, a pacifist in Bosnia, a single woman on the metro at 10 p.m., a peasant without land, a gang member in the slums, an unemployed worker, an unhappy student, And of course, a Zapatista in the mountains. Marcos is all the exploited, marginalized, oppressed minorities resisting and saying enough. He is every minority who is now beginning to speak and every majority that must shut up and listen. He is every untolerated group searching for a way to speak. Everything that makes power and the good consciousness of those in power uncomfortable. Of what good then? Or rather, I should say, what is the purpose of identity understood in this way? If not as articulations that mean and visualize relationships of power. Our diverse identities provide us, in fact, the basis from which we struggle. I am Chicano. But to be Chicano does not mean anything if not in the context of struggle, right? We wouldn't have even had to come up with this word, take on this word, if not to struggle. And I share that because, again, I want us, when thinking about Indigenismo from below, the Chicano movement's embrace of this term was precisely this reivindication of our indigenous heritage, our indigenous connection, that we come from a people who were de-indigenized, and we are seeking that reconnection. We are seeking positions of both solidarity to walk with indigenous people who, understood in this way, are indigenized people within a relationship of power. And that, in essence, what we, in thinking about, indigenismo from below, what we need to be thinking about is precisely the unpacking of these various different types of relationships of power and domination that are the product of this civilizational project of death. Aníbal Quijano, Peruvian sociology, ends a very important essay where he elaborates the constructions of race in the modern colonial world by saying, let us cease to be what we never were, right? We are different, diverse peoples. We all have histories. We all have our own pueblos. We all have where we come from. Let us embrace that and not the identities that were given and imposed on us. Let us be who we actually are and cease to be who we never were.
So when we think about the Zapatistas are not one indigenous group. They're an indigenous group of many different pueblos indígenas in Chiapas. And so when we think about the Zapatistas forming this identity as Zapatista, right, they're defying the project of Mexico, of imaginary Mexico, and they're articulating instead an indigenismo from below, we can argue, but to the left, right? It's a reclamation of who they are as people and saying we are in struggle, but we were just like everyone else in struggle as well. And so I think when we think about, indigenismo from above, especially today, we can, reference back to, AMLO and a lot of his performances of indigenismo, whether it was the Bastón de Manda, I don't know how to translate that, but, and him asking Mother Earth to build, El Tren Maya. So I think there's a cooptation that we can still see in Mexico and the state that tries to articulate itself through indigenismo, but it's indigenismo from above, and it's still reifying, or it's just making imaginary Mexico more stronger.
And the INPI, that's what differentiates the INPI from the CNI, right? And indigenismo invoked now in conjunction with the state and these projects of death, right? As opposed to that example which Zapatista, CNI, CIG provide us. So with that said, we want to conclude there and open up first for clarifications, questions, and then we do have a question that we want to actually post. Should we post it now, just so that maybe it'll also inform the clarifications? And so for when we break up into conversation here, you want to read them?
So given that we each inhabit different multiple intersectional identities and themselves
often fluctuating over time, how do we support each other's autonomies while respecting the respective contexts and weights of each of our own geographies?
So that'll be the question for conversation, but first we'll open it up for questions and clarifications.
Not all at once.
No me queda muy claro entonces, o sea, parece que es como la palabra indigenismo, es algo que ustedes indican, como que es una palabra, digamos, struggle, más que una palabra de oppression.
La de abajo.
O sea, tiene que qualify in order to be so. But what about mestizaje? Because it seems like in Bonfil Batalla, mestizaje is exactly the way for oppressing the indigenous identities, if something like that exists. But you said that the idea that the Spanish were in fact never, they were white. They were more like a mestizos, and the mestizaje to vindicate, to be mestizo in sort of like could be a conclusion that that's something that should happen as a way to struggle in the Mexican society?
So I'll quote Nespers Chicana, who I don't always necessarily agree with, but I do agree with her on this. And she says, when it comes to the word mestizo, I abhor that word, right? And she says that because she's drawing from Jack Forbes' understanding of, the exact title of the Forbes essay written back in the 50s or 60s is the mestizo concept, a product of European colonialism, right? And now, I'm sure somebody might be tempted to ask, well, what about Gloria Anzaldua's embrace of mestizaje? If you look at Gloria Anzaldua's embrace of mestizaje, she invokes this new mestiza consciousness, but in the very first instance that she mentions this, look at her footnote. Who's she referencing? Jack Forbes and the essay that I'm talking about. Right? Now, she chooses to embrace the term mestizo, I don't. But by pointing to Forbes and that essay, it's to point out that she's aware of the complicated history of that term and what it meant as part of this project of de-Indianization, right? And she's still choosing to embrace it, but we also have to contextualize her. She was growing up in Texas, where Mexicans were legally defined as white, but never treated as such. So for her, mestizaje is not about approximation to whiteness, but it's a move back towards the indigenous, right? So call yourself whatever you want. The point is not what is your identity. Your identity means nothing if it's not an identity that is going to allow you to mobilize for the purpose of struggle. If it's just a random identity like the Impi with the Baston de Mando doing a show for the state, then that's a commercialization, appropriation of identity. That's not struggle. So I think people can struggle, this is what the question is. You can struggle according to your own identities, but like Anzaldúa, if you're going to take up that term mestizo as something to embrace, then the minimum you could do as a starting point is recognize its problematic history, how it's tied to a project of de-Indianization, and then from there, you decide how you're going to now invoke it and move and struggle with it if that's what you choose. Should we, seeing that maybe there's no questions, I don't know, I'm kind of stunned that there's no other questions, but maybe, maybe one more, this might trigger some more, but otherwise maybe we should move to group discussion.
Not to finish the interesting computation about mestizo, but I was wondering if too the mestizo strategy could be that in Mexico, the white Europeans, mainly white Spaniards, would also use power against the mestizos in this kind of hierarchy that you're talking about. So even in the Raza Cósmica, for instance, that sort of project, this sort of liberationist in spirit as well, even though it's appropriate or not. So I mean, maybe this is just to reinforce your idea about identities tied to different struggles. But you know, everybody seems to be focused.
Yeah, so I guess the way I would respond to this, and maybe still related to the other one, is that this amestizamiento, as this brother from Guerrero that I mentioned earlier, is not that we're gonna pretend we're not mixed, is that we're gonna disinvest ourselves from a project of imaginary Mexico, that we're gonna embrace a Mexico profundo, right? That we're gonna highlight power, precise how it's used for the purposes of power, and instead, you know, walk with all our relatives, and not just indigenous relatives, but all our relatives in any relationship of domination that is being impinged on, right? And precisely for that, I want to ask if any questions from a non-male participant of our encuentro.
So I guess more than a question is a commentary, because I feel like it's a perfect example of what we're talking about. In Azqueltan, where we see the levantamiento, the rebellion in Jalisco, we see the Wirarica and the Tepehuano community unite, and they just celebrated 6 years of autonomy, and they did this using the original title of their land. They were able to recuperate, working with the CNI, walking with the Zapatistas, 40,000 hectares de tierra, of land. The last time they did this was when they were organizing against the Spanish colonizer in the 16th century. During the last ceremony, I was there, and I experienced, obviously, having a lot of conversations with community, and it was the first time where, I guess, the compañeros were telling me that a lot of the Tepehuanos started to identify as Tepehuana or Tepehuano, and actually dress in the Tepehuano clothes and start talking about recuperating the language and rejecting the label of mestizo. But all of that resulted from la lucha and kind of this struggle to recuperate the land, and there was tension between the mestizos, Tepehuanos, but those who identified as mestizos before, and the Wiraricas. And it was really beautiful to see that union come together, and then come together in ceremony in a way that they hadn't done in so long, right? So, I mean, talk about decolonizing, that it's never too late to decolonize, to reclaim your territory, to reclaim the language, to save it, right? And I think that it's a beautiful example of a lot of what we're talking about, and how they're resisting the Mexican state, and also the cartel corruption or the narco state that we see in the north, which is kind of what we're going to hear about a lot when we have our concejal who's here from Azqueltan, who's going to tell us about that. But as someone of Tepehuana Wirarica roots, it's been an experience where I just continue to remember the saying that an elder told me, that it's never too late to decolonize, right? And I think when I was younger, when I would go to Jalisco, I would hear, somos mestizos. You know, that's all I kind of knew. And then to find out about the resistance and all that is going on there, but really how, like we mentioned, or I noted earlier, la lucha necesita, like how there's an intersection between spirituality, your identity, and the struggle. But in the process of recovering the land, folks have reconnected over there, and kind of the way that they described it to us is like, we see the truth now, right? And we don't trust the state. And that's why what we're striving for in that region is autonomy. Just wanted to share that.
And also, it doesn't happen so quickly. I mean, it took us 500 plus years to get to this mess. So to me, decolonization is, you know, a slow, ongoing process. Right? We're not like one more encuentro away from being decolonized. Right? But I think maybe we should try to, I think Christian had one last word, and then we'll go to groups.
I just want to talk about, or just clarify that the word mestizo is not just a mixed person, it's a person who is also becomes an outsider, becomes a foreign person, like we saw with the Ladino. So a lot of indigenous communities have words that articulate like you're not from our community because you went to the city, you went to work, whether it's Gashlan, Coyome, Mestizo. So it's about the relationships that they have with their communities. So if we're thinking about this, I forgot how to say this. Yeah, a lot of we gotta put the context to how a lot of indigenous peoples, like compañera Daisy was saying, are really trying to go back to their heritage. You can see this in Purepecha territory. You can see this in South America. You can see this in the U.S., where a lot of indigenous peoples here who went through their own Indian schoolings are trying to relearn their language. Right? In Tongva territory in LA, there's no fluent speakers. Right? I know Tongva folks that find out that they're Tongva, when they're in the university. And what do those questions mean when their own grandmothers, their own mothers are telling them, you're just Mexican, you're just something else.
And to be clear, when we say this, it's not to say, indigenous only to here, right? We all come from somewhere. We all have our pueblos, but it's that process of seeking our pueblos, right? And wherever those may be, not just on this continent. And I say that because, again, if we go there, then we just fell right back into the indigenous here, white over there, black over there, and this compartmentalization of peoples that is just not the case. And I saw another hand up here and then one in the back.
My question is, how can we still aspire to, my understanding is like re-indigenize, but still be critical of the language that we use when we're talking about Chicanismo and the pursuit of Aztlán, when Aztlán is like native territory to other indigenous folks. So like, how would we situate ourselves within that? And what does it mean to be Chicanx within that context?
So two just quick points on Aztlán. I would say there's many conceptualizations of Aztlán, and even there we have, unfortunately, one that has become a dominant narrative of Aztlán, which is Aztlán is Southwest. Let me be very clear, Aztlán is not the Southwest. Aztlán may be in the Southwest, may be in Nayarit, may be multiple Aztlanes spread out through what is now known as Mexico, what is now known as Southwest. Even as far as Wisconsin, I personally think Aztlán is up somewhere near Utah, but that's a whole other issue. We can talk about, compare maps later. But the point is that Aztlán is Southwest is an example of a imaginary leftist Chicano that has accepted the terms of the debate of the civilizational project of death and now tried to map out Aztlán as nation state on a territory in the same ways as Western nation states. And that's why increasingly I differentiate between two categories, Chicanos y Chicanos que la cagan. But I say that not to just joke around, but because I think we need to have that conversation precisely for the second point, which is that across a lot of different peoples, there's also shared territories. I live currently in Kumeyaay territory, and there's a sacred mountain that both Kumeyaay and Luiseño have relationship to. And so for that matter, even when I say Aztlán is in Utah, it's not that I'm saying this is a place only for Chicanos and to hell with the Paiute relatives. On the contrary, the Paiutes tell us, oh, you Mexican, you're our cousins, you came from here. Welcome back, right? So again, it's about relationships and not just reducing Aztlán to either nation state or idea of one territory, one people, one identity. In fact, that's the project that began on the Iberian Peninsula when what are now Spaniards kicked out the Moorish people, kicked out the Jews, kicked out the Roma, right? That's the project of modernity, coloniality. That's a colonial project. So let's consider other notions of Aztlán that are there, that have been there, and not just since the 60s, but time immemorial in our own migration and origin stories. So I'm seeing more hands, and I do want us to have time for groups, but I also maybe want to take a pulse of the room and see how people feel, because there is a hand here on this side, and I think there was one in the back as well. So are folks okay with taking a couple more questions, or?
Yeah.
So, I guess to kind of reiterate your point on populations that came as settlers, colonizers, Moorish, Roma, Jews, and that have inhabited, colonized much of Latin America. Aviala, you see the possibilities and the dangers of essentializing indigenous identity by people that visibly have this ancestry, right? And without disregarding our own indigenous ancestral roots, but also acknowledging the very visible ties to, even areas such as Palestine, the Mideast, Arab world. If there's an appropriation by populations in resistance, right? Mestizo populations. I refer to them as mestizo for my lack of knowledge of actually knowing where exactly I'm rooted in, right? Arab territory. But is the dialogue and the conversation existent in acknowledging the dangers of appropriating or essentializing too much the identity of indigenous communities, and invisibilizing the struggles of the communities that continue to be in resistance for their languages, for their territories, both here on this side of the hemisphere, but also in the South. What are the possibilities of solidarity building within our own identities that are very complex? That's my question. I guess for everybody.
Should we maybe just to try to bring this part to a close, maybe if there's other questions also on the floor, get them all out together, and then maybe just one last response, just so that we could try to bring it to a close. But thank you for your question, because yes, I'll come back to a response to that. So we have one hand up here in the front, and then Arnoldo in the back after. Go ahead, tú primero y luego Arnoldo, or whoever wins with the mic getting there first.
All right, testing. So I think it's a great proposal because it implodes state-mediated, state-sanctioned ideas of, identity based on whatever race and racial formation each nation-state goes by. However, I'm just wondering, how do we get to a place where we can collectively implode them, and the multiplicities that need to be imploded? And I mean, the biggest joke is what became known as white, and whiteness as a thing that has this power. And I'm thinking that while we can implode whiteness also, and hopefully get whoever identifies as white to reject whiteness, because it's been a project that people have invested in for a long time,
how do we do that while at the same time we know that the police won't necessarily kill those bodies that currently identify as white? Where the material reality still gives some of us privilege because we are not considered indigenous, whether we might already individually want to seek that, but we're not there yet collectively. Like, how do we reconcile that is my biggest question. While I want to get there collectively, like, let's think about how, white people became white, how mestizos became mestizos, etc. I still think that there's such a struggle to think about the material, like body realities, that some of us have power. Even if we want to give it up, we're still going to be with that power in relationship to others that don't have power. Right? So I don't know. Question to everyone.
And Arnoldo? Hello. Buenas tardes, everybody. Thank you for aguantándonos. I think that what we are going through in this Encuentro and other gatherings that began when the Zapatistas came out January 1st, right, is that it's not unprecedented. So there was maroon communities of escaped slaves, of escaped Indians, escaped peoples that formed and band together to live together in freedom and in justice, right, against injustices. So when, for example, the concept of Aztlán is that we wanted to, it was an impulse of reconstituting ourselves as a people in the United States. And we were a people without land. We thought, but we have land, but we've been displaced for it. So if you think of yourself as an indigenous person, this is what happens to you, the way you get assimilated through capitalism and colonialism. You get dispossessed, you get dislocated, you get sent away, right? And then eventually we're gathered like this. We're all very different. We all come from different trajectories, different indigeneities. And for me, we have an opportunity, right? But it's going to take a long time to talk and understand each other. And we do have time to talk and understand each other. Because that's the way the Zapatistas did it. They didn't just organize clandestinely. They were talking for decades. Because they had to get their values right. They had to get, what do we stand for, so that when we speak, we're speaking as a people. When we do things, we're speaking as a community. So it's, one way that I've said it before, and I think it turns people off because it might sound harsh to your ears, is you have to be indigenous to be anti-capitalist. In other words, you have to be able to have a place that you defend the natural world that you're associated with. And we're on Ohlone land, for example. The Ohlones have a Sogorea land tax that you can all give to for being here, right? Because they're erased. I mean, the government erases them. We had our elder sister, talk about that. So there's different ways that you can return, start giving away both the privilege and the opportunity of being here on Ohlone land. And to do it back to the Zapatistas, right? They have always thought about bringing people together, and not saying you have to be this, that, and the other before they come together. So right from the beginning, 1994, they were bringing people together, and they would say, we're here to listen to you. So we also have to learn how to listen. That's one of the most powerful things in the world. Listening is the most powerful thing. Speaking, right now we have one mouth, and all you're hearing is what I know. But when I listen to you, I learn new things that I don't know. And it takes a lot to create community and community-based power, right? We have to be able to tolerate and listen. And I don't say aguantarnos in Spanish or in English. I mean, we have to be able to stand each other and stand each other through the worst and the best, because we give up really quickly, right? And we're not. And that's a Southern colonialist mentality, because we're not disposable people. And our relationships are not disposable. So when we get together, we got to stand each other. We just got to stand each other. Because we'll be sexist dogs, we'll be sexist anti-dogs, whatever you want to say, right? But we have to learn how to listen. And then to listen to the humanness in each other, and to listen for the indigeneity, saying, you want to be anti-capitalist? Because we have to give up all these values. We have to give up all, if you're going to be anti-capitalist, you got to give up all the capitalist values. We can't just say this, that, and the other, right? And maybe this, and then we go on our way. So, and I always get inspired by Zapatistas, right? If a small community can do it, that was seen as powerless or if they can do what they're doing, then we can too.
Okay, so just to wrap up, because we want to definitely go to groups. Everything that we've said here, I would say we've began, or to approach precisely from the perspective of not essentializing identities, right? That to recognize that even those identities that we almost kind of just take for granted, oh, I'm this, I'm that. This is the result of historical processes, and we need to understand. Like a Dominican sister of mine said, "Oh yes, black is beautiful, but how did we become black? Yes, brown is beautiful, but how did we become brown? There's white people too, but how did they become white? Right? Again, right? And here I turn to James Baldwin. People who think they are white. It's understanding those histories that turn people into white people, or people who think they are white, right, to use his language. And that comes not just as a question of skin color, but the actual material realities, resources, and so on. Right? So when we talk about re-indigenizing, it's not just trying to find if you have any indigenous ancestry here in this continent. No, not at all. It's trying to find where your peoples come from, all your peoples. And so for me, for that matter, I take to Chicano to mean that I am, for the lack of just reducing it, I have to spell out. I am a detribalized, de-indigenized person who was once indigenized to begin with. That comes from Wirarica peoples, comes from Mam peoples, and Basque and French, but shit happens. But I embrace them all. It's there, and that's okay. And we embrace them all, and we still acknowledge these material realities. And so, as Gloria Zaldúa writes about, we have to do both inner work and public acts. It matters not very little if you just do all this work of personal discovery to find out where you're from, and then it doesn't translate to public acts. You only do the inner work, you become a good hippie. You only do the outer work, you become a good Marxist. But you gotta do both together.
The key takeaway is to become a hippie Marxist. Don't do
that. The in-between would be not, I can't dare to say that the in-between is to become a Zapatista, but it is in fact to try damn hard to aspire to be able to walk in the same way that they have showed us how to walk. So let's go to groups. So time was happening. Okay, so can we get the MCs to inform us? What's happening? Okay, so apparently we're out of time. And the whole session's out.